All right. Hello again, Avengers, and welcome to another exciting episode of Daily December to the 2023. This is day number 3. Today, on, what was it, Friday, Thursday, something like that. Whatever the first was, you know, the day that I forgot was in December. New game came out called Dragon Dragon Quest Monsters. Yeah, there we go. I keep forgetting because the first game in this country was Dragon Warrior Monsters because Dragon Quest was copywritten in the U.S. and now everything is Dragon Quest and it's annoying. But anyway, so Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince, new game that came out for the Switch. I am a huge fan of the Dragon Quest Monsters subseries. I've played almost every one of them. I think the one I missed was the Game Boy Advance one, and it's a really great series. If you're unfamiliar with it, in Dragon Quest, I want to say 5, they introduced a mechanic that after you fought monsters, every so often one of the monsters might ask to join your team. And so they had this little kind of like monster catching, raising mini game. And it was so popular that they created a whole game around it. This was the first game came out on the original Game Boy, or it might have been Game Boy Color, but they're basically the same machine. And Pokemon was really big at this point. I mean, Pokemon hasn't really gone down in popularity, really, but Pokemon Red and Blue had been out for a little bit, and so the Dragon, the monster taming kind of subgenre was getting really popular. And if I remember correctly, this is going all off of my Swiss cheese memory, so I may be misremembering all of this. Feel free to correct me in the comments. But it was kind of written off as a kind of cheap Pokemon clone type of thing, and it's anything but. I own both Pokemon Sword and Shield. Well, I own Pokemon Sword, and then I also own Pokemon Violet. And I've played almost every Pokemon game. I think I missed after Pearl. I didn't play Diamond and Pearl. I stopped playing Pokemon until Ultra Sun, and then I got back into it. But big Pokemon fan. I enjoy Pokemon. Dragon Quest Monsters is nothing like Pokemon, aside from the fact that, yes, you do capture and train monsters. But beyond that, they're completely different games. The Dragon Quest Monsters series, you have multiple monsters in your active party at any given time. The first one, you had 3, and that stayed pretty consistent. And then eventually they switched it to you can have 4 monsters at a time. And then later on in the series, they started introducing different size monsters. So some monsters would take up 2 or 3 spaces. So you would only have like 4 spaces. But that might only be 2 monsters because one of your monsters is huge and another one's real small. So that in and of itself makes it a different game because you're basically doing triple and quadruple battles, which only happens in Pokemon. I don't believe they have quadruple battles ever. They do have double battles, and they've had those since, I want to say, Ruby Sapphire, maybe? I don't know. They might have introduced them in Gold Silver. I can't remember. But, I think there have been triple battles somewhere in there, but I can't be 100% certain. But having 3 monsters on the field changes things drastically because they can interact with each other, aside from switching one out and another. Types and weaknesses is not anywhere near as kind of a concrete thing. There are certain monster species that are weak against certain things and strong against other things, but it's not nearly as definitive of who's going to win the fight as it is in Pokemon. And probably the most interesting thing, you don't actually get to tell the monsters what to do. In the first Giga game, all you could do was give them kind of suggestions. You know, things like, attack them, defend yourself, heal the party, things like that. Eventually, they added in an ability where you have what are called tactics, which is exactly what I say. They'll have like a go all out, debuff the enemy, buff your friends, heal people, or use no magic are the different tactics you can give them. But you can also order them individually in the later games, including this one. I don't use that one. And I'm going to talk about, after I finish explaining anything, I'm going to talk about the point of this video. Because of that, how much your monsters liked you would massively change how they worked in battle, because if they didn't like you, they'd ignore your suggestions. And so and the other thing that was really, really important that is not really important in Pokemon unless you're like doing like competitive Pokemon, is the idea of, used to be monster breeding, now it's monster synthesis. But it's the same basic idea where you have two parent monsters and then they create a baby monster. In Pokemon, they've had breeding since the first generation. You put them in the daycare center, and apparently they're just really poorly supervised there. And as long as they belong to the same egg group, they'll create an egg. And if you really keep track of that, you can kind of customize Pokemon to become kind of the best, like min-maxed version of them, because you can make sure that the stats that you want them to have are the highest they can have. And it's a really complicated process, but it never does anything other than kind of minor adjustments. They might have access to an attack they normally wouldn't have, or a few of their stats would be higher than a normal, but it's still a Charmander. And that's never going to change. Monster Synthesis in Dragon Quest Monsters series, you take two parents, they have a kid, those parents go away. So you basically have to sacrifice two monsters to create a new one, and the new one is always more powerful than the previous generation. And so one of the things you have to do in Dragon Quest Monsters is you will eventually hit a level cap for your original monsters that you caught, and you will have to start synthesizing them to get monsters that are powerful enough to fight in the later things. So monster synthesis is really, really important. And the other thing is synthesizing monsters, unless you synthesize two of the same monsters or very similar monsters, the monster that you get afterwards is different. And this has changed over the years. Like in the original one, you could kind of predict what you were going to get, but it was still a little bit random. The more modern versions now, you pick the two parents and then it gives you a list of different monsters and you just choose the one that you like the best. And yeah, so Dragon Quest Monsters, just the series in general, has been one of my favorite series. The music itself, I can't get enough of. And this new one is really good. I think I'm only like, I might be 10 hours into it. I don't know. I haven't looked recently. But I'm not massively into it. I'm still in the kind of lower ranks of everything. I'm absolutely loving it. But whenever I play, and this is true about for Pokemon games that I play, I do this for Dragon Quest Monster games. And there's a few other genres where I basically create my own kind of quote-unquote challenge runs. And for the past few Dragon Quest Monsters games, I have been basically using the same rules. I'm going to share here because I'm interested to find out if other people have these like self-imposed challenges that they do in any games, whether it's a Pokemon thing or whatever. And for me, like just playing the game and not having these additional rules that don't actually matter, it's not as much fun for me. It gets really, really boring. But so these are my rules for playing a Dragon Quest Monsters game. So first rule, you are only allowed to have one team of monsters. Now, in the newer Dragon Quest Monsters games, you have your team that fights, and then you'll have an equal number of reserved team members. So that's what I consider a team. In Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince, by the way, this is not sponsored or anything. I had to buy my own copy of the damn game. Square Enix doesn't love me enough, doesn't care about me to give me anything for free. So please do not think that somehow I am getting something for this. I'm not. I just really like the game. So anyway, so my rule for you're only allowed one team is you're allowed a full set of monsters and then a full set of reserves. Because technically you carry all of those with you, very similar to in Pokemon, how you're allowed 6 Pokemon, but only one is out at any given time. Same basic principle. So in Dragon Quest Monsters, the Dark Prince, you're allowed 8 monsters. They are the first 8 monsters you scout. Capturing monsters in Dragon Quest Monsters. Again, the early version, you would just throw meat at the monsters and then hope after you killed them, they would resurrect themselves from the dead and go, hey, you're pretty cool, can I join you? That still happens in Dragon Quest Monsters, The Dark Prince. However, they have another system called scouting, which is basically you just pick a monster, and depending on how strong your team is, you try to just impress them into joining you. So for my rules, you can either have them randomly join you or you can scout them, but it is the first 8 monsters that you pick up. Those are the monsters you'll be using for the entire game. But Jody, you just said that you need to do the synthesize. We'll get to that. In addition to that, the first 8 monsters you have to give nicknames to. They cannot have just their monster name. You have to nickname them something. I tend to name the monsters after my friends. Because I am lonely and like to pretend that my friends actually play games with me. If you guys have ever seen TJ and Friends, my TJ and Friends play series, I do that a lot. It's my thing, and some of my friends are aware that this happens, and some of them are not. But nickname them anything that you want. And then, again, those are your monsters for the rest of the game. Now, you can scout and collect every other monster in the game. You really should, because of the next part. But you're not allowed to nickname any other monsters. Every other monster has to just be named monster name. When you unlock synthesizing, you're allowed to synthesize your main team members, the only monsters with nicknames. The limitations on that, you can't synthesize a monster with a nickname with another one. So anytime you synthesize one of these monsters, it has to be with a no-name. And the resulting offspring has to have the same nickname as the one that you just sacrificed to create this new monster. So yes, you do get to do the synthesizing and stuff like that, but it's basically kind of like an evolution thing in Pokemon where every so often it'll just change into a new monster. But the names have to be consistent. You have to have one of every one of those names going out throughout the entire run. And the other little limitation I put on there is you're only ever allowed to collect one of every monster. And that includes synthesis. So if you catch a monster and then when you're doing synthesis, you find that you can actually synthesize that monster, too bad. You already have it in your collection. You cannot synthesize a monster to do that. So that does mean that if you scout or if you find a monster, you're like, oh, I want to use that in my party, you better not actually scout it or let it join you, because then you're not going to be allowed to synthesize it, and the only way you can use it is for synthesis material. And then my other rule is, other than specific fights with metal monsters, because metal monsters, you can get metal slimes and stuff that show up as enemies, and they are super hard to hit and like to run away from fights. So you have to use very specific skills to actually hit them. And they give off tons. They give like 10 to 20 times the amount of experience that a normal monster their level would. So those you're allowed to use the orders and tell them to attack specific monsters and use specific skills. But other than that, you're not allowed to give your monster specific orders. You can only change their tactics. And they have a new feature in Dragon Quest Monsters where you can tell them not to use specific skills when you're when they're acting on their own. So that I allow for this because it's nice, and there are certain monsters that I remember just becoming unusable because their AI, for whatever reason, would always make them use this really bad attack. and they drain their magic points and then be completely worthless. So those are my rules. There's not a lot of them, but it definitely makes the game feel different. I still go through and collect every single monster that I can because I want to use them for fusion materials and see the cool stuff that I can make. And I've been having a blast with it. Yeah. Overall, I didn't know what I wanted to talk about today, and I've just been playing a lot of Dragon Quest Monsters, so I'm like, let's talk about that. So for anyone that made it to the end of this video, do you have self-imposed challenges that you do? Do you do things like Nuzlocke? Nuzlocke are a self-imposed challenge for Pokemon games. If you don't know what a Nuzlocke is, it's kind of similar to what I do, where the rules are effectively the first Pokemon you meet in each area is the only one you're allowed to capture. If you accidentally make it faint, then you don't get to collect a Pokemon from that area. And if any of your Pokemon are brought to 0 hit points, you have to release that Pokemon because it has died. And there's other rules to it, but that's kind of the basics. There's different versions of Nuzlocke and things. So do you play Nuzlocke? Do you do other kind of self-imposed challenges for any of the games that you run, not just like monster catching games, but any games? I'd like to know in the comments down below. And I'm also going to put in the description, I'm going to put my Dragon Quest Monsters rules in there in case anybody wants to try any of the Dragon Quest Monster games. Though I will admit, once you get to the DS ones, they tend to be a little bit more friendly. The original Game Boy ones, and then the Game Boy Advance one I haven't tried that much, or I've never played the Game Boy Advance one. But the Game Boy games are a bit rough because they came out in the 90s and they have that kind of 90s grind to them. But as long as you start at least on the DS ones, these rules work perfectly fine. There's actually remakes that were only released in Japan of the first 2 games, but there may or may not, I can neither confirm nor deny that there are English translation patches somewhere, but I would know nothing about those. But yeah, let me know first of all, if you guys want to try. Wow, I got something in my eye and it's driving me nuts. Let me know if you guys have any self-imposed rules, or if you're going to try my Dragon Quest Monster rules, and let me know how it goes for you, because I'm having lots of fun. Currently, my buddy Elias is a chocolate golem, because that is one of the monsters that exists, and it's a golem, but it's made of chocolate and has a little red ribbon around it. It is adorable. So you're welcome, Elias. You're a chocolate golem. Anyway, that's all for me today. I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.